Did you see that? Wait. How does that work? So one of the fundamental things about Genshin Impact is how elements interact with each other to create elemental reactions, and you can do some pretty nutty damage with that. So in an effort to actually educate myself and hopefully someone else out there on how all of this stuff works, I wanted to do a ton of research on this and kind of figure out how it works for myself so that you guys can also learn. So when it comes to reactions, there are a couple of things that we need to define really quick. First thing that we're going to define is the elemental source. So there are technically two different elemental sources. You can have an aura element, or more of like what some people call a gauge element, or you can have a trigger element. So if we look here, we are going to apply Electro to this Sensen mage, right? So we have used Razor to apply Electro, meaning we are the aura element or the gauge element, because the Sensen did not have any other element attached to it whenever we attacked it. So Razor has become the aura element for that Sensen. Now if we take Ganyu here and we apply Cryo, Cryo is the second element being applied on top of the Electro. Therefore, that is the trigger element. And you'll notice whenever we do that, it causes Superconduct to show up on the screen. Superconduct is the specific reaction that we're having with those two elements. Bruh, stay away. I'm trying to record a video. Quit. Yes, thank you. As long as there is not an element already applied to a character or an enemy, whenever you attack them with something that is imbued with the element, whether it's an elemental skill or whether you're using an elemental burst, or even if your normal attacks have been overridden by another effect like Chongyun or like Diluc's elemental burst. So the first element that gets attached is called our aura element, and that element is going to stick onto the enemy or our character for a specific duration. Now that duration is something that's a little bit more complicated than what I want to cover in this video, and we'll talk about that in an upcoming video that kind of goes a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole. But just know that you're not always going to have the element applied to you or to the enemy. It will eventually fall off. You can always know if an enemy or yourself is inflicted by some sort of element just by looking either above their HP bar or their level, depending on what kind of enemy you're fighting, or for yourself, it will be actually just above your HP bar as well. Now, there are some special cases. So if you take a look at these slimes right here, you'll notice that one of them is a Hydro slime. The larger slime is a Hydro slime, and he will always have Hydro attached to him. We can cause reactions with him, and you can see that the reactions will happen, but that Hydro will not actually go away. He is permanently infused with Hydro. Now, because he's frozen, technically we have stacked the Cryo on top of Hydro, but he still always will have that Hydro element. We can go ahead and do that, and we're just causing reactions with this guy, and it's just ticking, doing a little bit of damage, but he never loses his Hydro. So the significance of that is certain elements are going to always be applied to certain enemies, and bosses are typically some of the ones that have like immunities to these. So if you look at any of the hypostasis bosses, they all have an immunity to their own particular element. So the electro hypostasis can't be attacked with electro attacks and stuff like that. You can, technically, but it just won't do any damage. Same goes for the Animo version, and same goes for the Geo version, things like that. Like they all kind of are immune to their own element. Slimes are also immune to their own elements. Certain reactions, the way that they trigger, you'll still end up getting some immunities whenever you do those reactions as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. Then for our trigger element, the only unique thing is that you can never have the trigger be the first element that is applied to an enemy. If the enemy has a element that is constantly being applied, like a hypostasis or a slime, they technically have that element imbued first, so you are always going to be the second element to apply on top of that. Once you apply that second element though, that is actually what causes the reaction, and the trigger element is usually the most important when it comes to these reactions. Another important thing to note is the internal cooldown. So what we're going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to pop this ult, and I'm going to pop this ult, and you'll notice Superconduct is showing up. But you'll notice, even though I'm hitting these enemies, Superconduct only appears on the first hit. So there is an internal cooldown See, that enemy had overload on him, but even though I was attacking him and he still had extra pyro on him, he wasn't getting hit with overload every single hit. So there is actually an internal cooldown that happens between these specific auras and triggers. Now, this is kind of a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk a little bit more about this whenever we go over the gauges and stuff like that. We're really going to do kind of like a deep dive into aura elements in general. After the cooldown starts, after you make a reaction, the cooldown is going to start, and it's a hidden cooldown. It doesn't show it to us in the game, and it just basically doesn't allow the reactions to be constantly applied. You have to wait a couple of seconds before the reaction can be hit again. Now, they are separate between enemies. If you notice, when Razor attacked one Hilichurl, the other Hilichurl, even though Hilichurl A is on cooldown, Hilichurl B has a totally separate cooldown. So you can still apply Overload, Superconduct, whatever against that other enemy. And they are also separate from other sources. I like to think of this in terms of pairs. If Razor has attacked Hilichurl A, but he hasn't attacked B yet, then both A and B between Razor, those are two different pairs between the two. Now think of a situation where you have something still on the field on top of Razor. Think about either Oz or Gooba from Zhangling. If you have one of those on the field, but their character isn't the active character on the field, if Razor is actually the character you have currently on the field, Razor and Hilichurl A have an internal cooldown, Gooba and Hilichurl A have a cooldown, and Oz and Hilichurl A have a cooldown. So you can kind of manipulate this if you have a bunch of different sources. If you have a bunch of different destinations that you're trying to apply reactions to, you can get around the internal cooldown simply by having more sources and destinations. One quick note though is Electrocharged is kind of unique because it does hit twice whenever you apply it. It has a tick whenever it first applies, and then it has a second tick later on. That is a mandatory cooldown, just the way that Electrocharged works. It has to have a 60 frame cooldown, roughly 1 second. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you at least know what all of the reactions are for this particular scope. If you don't know what the reactions are and you want a little bit more detail about how to apply them, how they're applied, and what they actually do, I do have another video out there talking about the reactions that you could definitely go check out. So whenever we talk about these reactions, there's kind of two different categories that we can break them down into. We have transformative reactions and amplifying reactions. Those two categories kind of dictate how the reactions go through the game and determine how much damage they're going to do. So transformative reactions are going to be Overload, Superconduct, Electrocharge, Swirl, Shatter, and Crystallize. Now, that sounds like a lot, but basically it's everything except Vaporize and Melt. That's the easiest way to memorize it. So what things actually go into affecting a transformative reaction? Well, the character's level is very important because it does play a factor in the formula for it. And the character's elemental mastery is also very important. It plays a huge part in the formula also. Then there's kind of a hidden mechanic that we can't really see, but the enemies actually have an elemental resistance. So the damage formula has been kind of squashed out for a lot of the game, and we've noticed that there are a couple of different things that prevent an enemy from taking the full amount of damage based on the math that we should do, which we would call their resistance. There is a physical resistance and an elemental resistance. I've already gone over the physical resistances in another video talking about how to calculate damage, which again, I'll try to leave it in a card up there, but just know that every character does have an elemental resistance, so therefore we do have to play around that as well. Most enemies in the game actually just have a 10% resistance. They're not really too crazy, but certain enemies have different resistances than others. So if you see here, we actually have a Pyro Whopper Flower. Now, Whopper Flowers are a little unique because they have a 35% resistance to all elements except their own element, which they have a 75% resistance to. So if we try to hit him with a fire attack, you'll notice we only do 424, but if we try to hit him with an overload or an electric attack, it does a ton more damage. Now, of course, there's a lot of variance between my Razor and my Bennett here, but the simple fact of the matter is that this guy takes a lot of reduced damage from pyro attacks simply just because he is a pyro element. Some other things that have some resistances are the Samaturals. They have, their specific elements, like the Anemo and the Hydro versions of those. They have a buffed up increase elemental resistance to those respective elements and things like that. But for the most part, everything is roughly 10%. So why is all that even important? Well, what we can do is we can actually figure out how much damage we can do with a specific reaction based on that knowledge. So this is actually the exact same spreadsheet that I made for the damage calculator video that we did a while back. You guys can basically just go to this exact same spreadsheet, make a new copy if you already have a copy, and then you should be good to go. I did update a couple of things and changed around some of the resistances and stuff like that because they were a little bit off, but we actually have a new page for transformative reactions and we have one for amplifying reactions. So for the transformative reactions, like we said, we need elemental mastery, character level, and enemy resistance. Just know that the elemental mastery that goes into this is always going to be the trigger element. If Ganyu is applying superconduct to an enemy that already has electro applied to it, we are going to end up taking Ganyu's elemental mastery and putting that through the formula. Ganyu's level is the level that we'll use. It's always the trigger element that is used for these formulas. But on the flip side of that, if Ganyu has applied cryo to something and Oz is on the field and ends up applying the superconduct, Oz is the trigger character, or Fischl is who it comes back to. So Fischl's elemental mastery and Fischl's level is what we end up taking whenever it comes to the formula. So if we take a look at a couple of examples here, you'll notice that we do have Diluc versus a Hilitrol. Now, one quick note is that this is the Reddit thread that all of this information is coming from. It's got all of the formulas. It's got a ton of good information in there. One thing that they do note is that these formulas go down to like 10 decimal places in some points, simply so they can try to be as accurate as possible, but it's still not 100% accurate. So some of the numbers that you put in, you may get like roughly 10 points of damage difference between the spreadsheet and what you actually have in game, but it should be pretty freaking close enough that you should be able to rely on, all right, if I increase my elemental mastery right here, how much more damage am I going to do versus a level, stuff like that. So if we take a look at a couple of these examples here, we have Diluc versus the Hilitrol. Now these guys are being inflicted by overload. So on our transformative thing, we would go in here and we would just say overload is the actual type of reaction. Diluc's elemental mastery is at 42, so we would just put in 42. Now this gives us an elemental bonus of 19.35. So where does that come from? If we take a look at our character sheet for Diluc, you'll notice our elemental mastery is 42. Now, if you actually ever read this underneath elemental mastery, it increases damage caused by vaporize and melt by 8.1, also increases damage caused by overload, superconduct, electrocharge, shattered, and swirl by 19.4. Okay, so since we are doing overload, we should have 19.4%. Now, the formulas and the spreadsheet roughly equate to about 19.4 if we were to round up. So that is pretty close. So now we input our character's level, which you can see on this picture. It's kind of hard to see in the video, but it is level 60, which is what we have here. So we're just going to put in 60, and we have our enemy's resistance. So the resistance of this Hilitrol is actually 10%. And you can go to these other sheets if you need to double check your resistances, or you can look them up online. There's plenty of places that have them there. So we'll type in the 10%, which gives us a overload base damage of 985.84. So where does that come from? Well, the overload base damage is a specific formula dedicated just to overload. And this specific one only takes into account our level. Now, I'm not going to go like super in depth on the formula and why this is important or anything, but essentially we are taking the base, we're trying to figure out the base damage of the reaction, just like we would try to figure out the base damage of an attack whenever we're doing a physical attack. We're trying to just find the base raw damage that we have for that particular reaction. So once we figure that out, we then do the bonus number that we had, which was the 19.4 times our base damage. And we end up getting 1,059 damage. Now, if we look in the picture, we hit 1,053. So again, a little bit of a tolerance in the variance, but very, very close, very, very solid. So now if we take a look at Lisa versus this Whopper Flower, this Whopper Flower is very interesting. So we have Superconduct, we have an elemental mastery of 48, which does equate to 22.02. So if we want to verify that, I'll roll over to Lisa really quick. 48 on the Elemental Mastery, you can see there. And we do have a 22.1 there. So very, very close. Our character level is at level 60, which you can verify in the picture. And our base damage. Now the enemy resistance here is 75%. The short of it is because we are doing an elemental reaction based off of cryo, it ends up using the cryo resistance that the Whopper Flower has, not the electro resistance. I'd be very interested to do a little bit more research on why, if it does that like in other places, if there's other enemies that it does that with. I know if you try to superconduct certain slimes, it just says immune. If you try to swirl certain slimes, it just says immune. So I need to do a little bit more research on that, but essentially we do the 75 resistance here because that's what the Whopper Flower has, and it ends up giving us a damage of 75. Now if you take a look, we end up with a 74 on screen. Notice that the 43 is actually the number from her catalyst attack, and then 74 is the actual superconduct. Our next example is Razor versus a Hilichurl. So we are doing electrocharged here. Razor had 13 elemental mastery in this image, which is an elemental bonus of 6.15. Our character level is 50. Now I can't verify that because I've actually leveled up my Razor since this. Electro base damage, electrocharge base damage here, enemy resistance of 10, just like before, which should equate to 371. You'll notice that we hit 370, which is pretty spot on. Next we have Sucrose versus these Hilichurls. So we are doing a swirl based reaction, elemental mastery of 139, which gives us an elemental bonus of 60.07. Character level 60, swirl base damage there, enemy resistance there, for a total of 425, and we end up hitting 424. Now you'll notice that 424 does appear twice per enemy. So we have 2 times per this enemy, and then we have 2 times for this other enemy in the back. This is a special case, and we're going to go into swirl a little bit more in depth in a third video. So just kind of keep that in mind for later. And our last transformative reaction example, we have Shattered. So Shattered is a little unique because it takes a frozen enemy being hit with a heavy attack like a claymore, and it applies an extra chunk of damage on top of what you already have done. Think of it as like you're breaking the ice. But here we see Diluc attacking a frozen Hilichurl with an elemental mastery of 42 again, elemental bonus there, character level there, enemy resistance of 10, and we end up with 796 on the final damage. So we end up hitting 790, so a little bit of a difference, but still very, very close. So why is any of that significant to you at all? Well, you can kind of see from this specific interaction between these characters and what it takes for transformative reactions. If you are trying to build a superconduct team, if you're trying to build a overload team, know that the way that those inherently work is based off of the elemental mastery of the triggers. So whoever you see doing those reactions the most on your team, they need to be pumped full of elemental mastery. If you have Gooba doing a lot of the reactions, then boost Zhangling's level higher up to get more damage out of that. Boost her elemental mastery higher up to get more damage out of that. If Oz is going to be doing it the most, use Oz. Use Fischl to gain your level and your elemental mastery on Fischl, and Oz will end up doing more overload damage. You can kind of play around with it like that, and you can kind of see if we were to take, so recently there was a video where Sucrose had 900 elemental mastery. I'm just gonna cut it back just a little bit because I think that's overkill. But just for example, if we have a level 90 character who has 700 elemental mastery, you can see that superconduct will end up doing 1582 on the damage. Overload would do 6,223. Swirl damage is 1861. Electrocharged 3775. But remember, electrocharged actually ticks twice. There is that cooldown before it ticks again. So technically electrocharged is going to hit 2 times here, which would end up being 7,550 damage, something like that. So that's still even more than overload, which is pretty nuts. So the only other one that we didn't really talk about is Crystallize. So Crystallize is quite unique in terms of what it's actually doing. Crystallize is actually going to give better shielding. So if we take a look here, increases the damage absorption power of shields created by Crystallize by 14.7%. The reason that that's important is because if you boosted your elemental mastery to let's just say 700, you end up getting an elemental bonus of 147.97, which means that the shield that you generate from that crystallized shield is going to be 147.97 more effective at absorbing that specific element. So if you have a Geo character that you pump full of Elemental Mastery, essentially what you're doing is making those shields way stronger, way stronger. So now let's talk about amplifying reactions. These are the two reactions that I'm sure that you've seen some stupid damage numbers out there where Mona hits for like 1,000,000 damage or something like that. That's because inherently the way that the vaporize and melt reactions work is they are separate in terms of how they are calculated. Essentially, we have two different reactions, but we have two different variations of those reactions underneath that. So for vaporize, for instance, if you are attacking something with pyro and it is already inflicted with hydro to induce that vaporize reaction, you're going to get 1.5 times the normal damage that you would off of the pyro attack that hits. But if you have an enemy affected with pyro and you hit them with a hydro based attack, you are going to end up vaporizing them for 2 times the amount of damage that you normally would. But it's based off of whatever triggers it here again. Melt works the exact same way. If you have something that is inflicted with pyro and you attack it with cryo, we often refer to that as reverse melt, you get 1.5 times damage. If you have something that is frozen or inflicted with cryo, you end up attacking it with pyro and you get 2 times the amount of damage that you would with that pyro attack. So what actually goes into an amplified reaction? So essentially here we have the exact same sheet that we did back on the talents. So just to figure out how much a talent is going to do, just like an elemental skill or a normal attack, the third hit of a normal attack, whatever. The exact same stuff goes into figuring out a melt or a vaporize. So what we're going to do is at the very top, we have our aura element, whether it is affected by pyro, hydro, or cryo. Then we have our trigger element, which is all the same. If you end up trying to do like 2 pyros, it just says invalid here, and it'll end up messing up the formula later. But if we have pyro and we affect hydro, you can see vaporize is going to happen at 2 times. Then what you would end up doing is going through this damage calculation, which again, that link will be down in the description if you need to know how to do all of this. You'll go through all the steps to figure out your base attack, your attack percentages, your flat attacks from all your artifacts, your damage bonuses, your skill multipliers, your level, the enemy's resistance to this elemental attack, because of course we're trying to induce an elemental reaction. The elemental mastery also does go into this because it does use the elemental bonus, which we saw from the character sheets, and we end up getting a finalized vaporized damage. But very uniquely, because the underlying attack that you're doing from your elemental skill, elemental burst, whatever, because that can crit, so can the vaporize. So vaporize and melt actually have the possibility of critting. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. In this image here, we actually see Diluc attacking a Hilitroll that is afflicted by Hydro. So we are applying Vaporize with Pyro as our trigger element. So you can see the aura element here is Hydro, trigger element is Pyro, which means we should hit Vaporize for 1.5 times the damage. So we go through the process of getting all of Diluc's information for his elemental skill. Now we're using the very first hit of his elemental skill to actually induce this. So we'll use his base attack, all the percentages and flat attack from his artifacts, all of the damage bonuses, which do keep in mind, you get damage bonuses from artifact sets, from goblets and stuff like that. Usually the easiest way to find it is just on the character sheet, like in the summary. So if we go to details here, the numbers that you see at the bottom here, so Ganyu's cryo damage bonus is 53.7. That's usually a pretty reliable number, but also do remember that certain weapons will give you attack bonuses as well. For my Diluc specifically in this scenario, Skyward Pride actually gives me an increased 8% damage. So that is actually tacked on to what you would normally have in this 38.7 here. Then we take our skill multiplier, which just comes from the talent, our level, enemy resistance. Our elemental mastery, again, was 42 for this day. And our elemental bonus is there, which means we should hit for 1565 on the vaporize. And as you can see, we hit for 1566. So very, very close. So now let's take a look at a reaction between Child and this Hilitrol that is a vaporized, but in the reverse direction. So we have our aura element of Pyro, our trigger element of Hydro, base attack, attack percents, flats attack, damage bonuses, skill multiplier, R level, enemy resistance, elemental mastery, elemental bonus for a 23-24 on the damage. But wait, we hit 37-26. Oh, it's crit. So we actually do end up getting a crit here, which crits for 3,726 damage. Spreadsheet assumed 3,727. So very, very close. Now let's take a look at some melts really quick. So we do have Diluc actually applying melt to this Ruin Guard here for 2,040. So here again, Cryo hit with Pyro is going to melt at 2 times the normal damage. So we take all of our same stats, level, enemy resistance, elemental mastery gets our bonus for 2,038, which is very close here at 2,040. Now let's take a look at Kaya hitting for 2,905 damage. So we are Pyro going to attack with Cryo for a melt of 1.5. All of Kaya's stats in here, damage bonuses, skill multipliers, level, enemy level, all yada yada yada. Elemental mastery ends up giving 1619. But wait, 2905, it was a crit. So we end up hitting 2906 on the spreadsheet, 2905 actually in game. So very, very close on the damage there. So when talking about these amplified reactions, how can we go about maximizing the amplified damage? Well, honestly, it's just going to come down to how good your talent levels, how good your stats are, how good everything is. These are definitely, in my opinion, these are the in-game reactions that you're going to be going for. A very popular team that a lot of people like to roll with is a team between Diluc and Xingqiu. Simply because these two, when you ult with both of them, Xingqiu is going to constantly being applying Hydro, and Diluc is going to constantly being applying Pyro. So they work in tandem to do a lot of vaporize back and forth between each other. That is definitely an in-game reaction team in my mind, because the higher level that both of these guys have, and the higher stats, the higher attack, the higher elemental mastery, all of that stuff, you know, worked in, all of that stuff is going to go towards getting a super big vaporize damage. So hopefully that kind of sheds some light on how you can actually calculate the reaction-based damage that you often see in game, but it doesn't really make it clear where that damage is coming from. Obviously, elemental mastery is a huge component of building out these reactions, but is it really the end-all be-all? That's kind of what my ultimate question is with this. I've been seeing a lot of videos pop up lately is elemental mastery a trap on X character, XY character, whatever? I also have that question, but I want to see for myself and make my own judgment. I haven't actually watched any of those videos, but I know that if you build attack, you can do tons of damage. But obviously, by building elemental mastery, you can do tons of damage as well. So therefore, ultimately, my goal is to figure out what's more worthwhile. But hey, we'll figure that out. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. The links to all of the information that I've used for this video, the Reddit thread, the spreadsheet that I created for you guys will be in the description, and you can use that at your leisure. Just make a copy of it and you should be good to go. If you find anything in this video that was incorrect or anything like that, please let me know, just so that I can kind of correct myself and hopefully other people can see it as well, because at the end of the day, knowledge is power, boys, and that's all I want to do. I want to be more knowledgeable. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. See you guys later. Major shout out to Cherry Blue, who is a YouTube member.